Here's the thing nobody tells you before you go back. You leave home as one version of yourself. You spend years, sometimes decades, being shaped by another country, another culture, another set of expectations and rhythms. And then you go back and you discover that home has moved on. It hasn't waited for you. Home has moved on, and home has an opinion of who you have become. If you know what I'm talking about, and I suspect most of you who are watching this do, then this video is for you. Today, we're talking about return migration, returning home, the act of going back, the statistics, the romanticized version, the reality, and the version that nobody puts on social media, the one where you returned back home. Expect somewhat of a hero's welcome, maybe. Instead, discover home has its own opinion of you now. We're looking specifically at Jamaica and Kenya, two countries, two diaspora communities, two sets of people who left and then built lives abroad, kept sending money home, kept telling their children about where they came from, and now face the question of whether going back is actually possible or advisable. Spoiler alert, it is complicated. And the complications for Jamaica and Kenya are more similar than either country could care to imagine. I know this personally. This is Jamaican in Kenya. Before we get into why people go back or don't, let's establish what the data actually says, because there's a significant gap between what the diaspora communities say they intend to do and what they actually do. Jamaica's diaspora is roughly 3 million people living abroad, essentially matching the entire population of the island. That's an extraordinary ratio. And Jamaica's cultural pull is unmatched in the Caribbean. The Jamaican identity not only anchors the diaspora, but it also keeps the diaspora psychologically tethered to home across generations. And yet, the number of Jamaicans who actually return permanently has been falling for 30 years. According to the Jamaican Association for Resettlement of Returning Residents, JAR for short, reports approximately 27,000 returned residents currently living on the island. Another stats, a shipping company that specializes in diaspora moves reportedly handling just about 50 relocations in 2024, down from over 200 in the 90s. And here's the figure that tells the starkest story. In 2024, of all people who landed permanently in Jamaica, voluntary returnees account for just 8%. 8%. Deportees who were involuntarily removed from the UK, the US, and Canada accounted for 20%. No, this is not return migration. This is forced removal. And we're not focusing on that today. Here is, however, one other stat that has been documented when it comes to migration to Jamaica, into Jamaica. And that is the foreign-born immigrants. And that accounted for the remaining 72% of individuals who permanently landed in Jamaica in 2024 were foreign-born immigrants. Kenya's picture is different in texture. According to the International Organization for Migration, a survey found that 89% of Kenyans in the diaspora said they intend to return home. 89%. That's an extraordinary number. And 34% of that number says that they visit Kenya every 6 months, which speaks of the powerful ties that are actively maintained. And yet, Kenya has no formal tracking system for returnees, no official count, no reintegration program for those who do come back. But here's an interesting stat. The dominant pattern for Kenyans appear to be what researchers call dual life engagement, maintaining a life and identity abroad while investing in Kenya, visiting frequently and planning to return home after they've made their plans, invested, set up homes, and then decide to retire later on, which is very similar also in what happens in Jamaica. Now let's talk about the pull, because before we get into the complications, and there are many, we need to acknowledge that the desire to return is real. It's deep and it's not irrational. The 2018 Windrush scandal, where the UK government wrongfully detained and deported Caribbean people who had been living legally in Britain for decades, in some cases for 50 years. That crystallized something that many in the community already knew, that no matter how long you live in Britain, no matter how much you contribute, there is a version of that country that will never quite see you as fully belonging there. That realization for many was the moment the idea of returning home stopped becoming a retirement fantasy and became something more urgent. The Jamaican and Caribbean diaspora continued to experience persistent alienation, being racialized, othered, and stereotyped, and found that their most stable sense of identity is specifically in their Jamaicanness. Jamaica has built the most formalized diaspora engagement architecture in the Caribbean. The Returning Residence program offers duty-free concessions on personal effects. The Global Jamaica Diaspora Council, which has 30 members representing communities in the UK, USA, Canada, Africa, Asia Pacific, Europe, and the Middle East. Kenya's pull factor is different in character. The dominant narrative for Kenyan returnees is entrepreneurial opportunities, specifically the tech ecosystem that is grown around the Nairobi Silicon Savannah branding. Additionally, real estate investments, which is the largest single use of diaspora savings. This is also what Kenyans focus on when looking to return home. Now, for context, how do Jamaica and Kenya compare to their regional neighbors when it comes to returning home? In the Caribbean, Guyana now has the strongest emerging return movement, largely driven by its oil boom. It's said that entrepreneurs are chasing petrodollars. Barbados launched the Welcome Stamp digital nomad visa in 2020, and it has been genuinely innovative and successful. The digital nomad program has far exceeded the number of immigrants going into Barbados compared to the number of Bayesians returning home to Barbados. In Africa, Nigeria represents the starkest contrast. The Japa movement, which is basically Yoruba for to run or flee, saw approximately 3.7 million Nigerians immigrate in 2022 and 2023, and they weren't coming back to Nigeria, they were exiting Nigeria. So hence, Nigeria is not managing a return migration, they're managing an exodus. Ghana, on the other hand, ran the Year of Return campaign in 2019, which generated 750,000 visitors and 1.9 billion in tourism revenue. But it only yielded approximately 1,500 African Americans that relocated to Ghana. South Africa has no dedicated diaspora engagement commission, and it is more focused on managing immigration coming into the country, and specifically from Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Southern African countries. As one of their main focus, and one of the things that they're grappling with, is xenophobic tensions. What sets Jamaica and Kenya apart from the others is that their return motivation is identity-driven, not event-driven. It is not triggered by a government campaign or an oil discovery. It is continuous, generational, and it persists regardless of policy. And that is both its strength and, what we're about to discuss next, its complication. Here's the thing nobody tells you before you go back. You leave home as one version of yourself. You spend years, sometimes decades, being shaped in another country, another culture, another set of expectations and ways of moving through that world. And then you go back and you discover that home has not been waiting for you. Home has moved on, and home has an opinion of who you have become. In Jamaica, the experiences of returnees are well documented, but rarely spoken about openly. The whispers about foreign arrogance, the assumption that because you left, you think you're better. A deputy mayor, an elected official, once called returnees cowards who ran away to America. Imagine, this was said out loud by an elected official, and said this of people who left to go abroad to build lives, to come back to reintegrate into Jamaican society. That was said. This is why there's often a fundamental tension between homeland desire for the diaspora resources and its resentment of the diaspora privilege. You are celebrated in the abstract and in conference speeches, in diaspora policy documents, in the government appeal for investments, but you're resented specifically in the community where you renovated your house and it's said to be slightly too large, or where your children speaks a foreign accent and they're called stush. These are discrepancies that returnees live with daily in Jamaica. The reverse culture shock is real and largely unacknowledged. The infrastructure that could often go awry. And I'm not talking about physical infrastructure. I'm talking about the day-to-day policies that you have to navigate throughout the island. The infrastructure is not what you're accustomed to. Electricity costs are amongst the highest in the Caribbean. Water supply is unreliable. Contractors who disappear mid-build. A labor market where international experience is respected in theory, but does not open doors without the right local connections. And so many more. I have a list, so many more. And I'm sure you can add the list in the comment below. But the one that sits on the minds of individuals looking and hoping that they could return home is the security question. Security from theft, security from violation, security from death. The security question. According to the Jamaican Association for the Resettlement of Returning Residents, again, JAR for short, they documented roughly 300 returning residents that were unalived over the period of 2010 to 2020. 300 people who went back. This is not conspiracy. And it does hurt me to actually say this. I never covered it in this video in depth, but this is why we need to have those conversations. It's not that people don't want to come back to Jamaica. It's the infrastructure or lack thereof that is keeping returnees at bay. Kenya's returnee challenges are different in nature. The primary deterrent is corruption, land fraud, and professional gatekeeping. Land fraud is pervasive and specific. Double allocation of the same plot, fake title deeds, a largely manual land registry system that makes remote verification nearly impossible for someone who's managing property from abroad. It is well documented. It's a well-documented pattern, not the exception to the rule. The Moju syndrome. Moju is a Swahili word for abroad. Hence, the Moju syndrome is the tendency for returnees coming back from the diaspora to be looked at or treated as walking ATMs. You are not welcome as a skilled professional or an entrepreneur. You're welcome as a source of money, gifts, and favors. Now, I'm not Kenyan, and I stand corrected if this is incorrect. And please add your comment in the comment section as to whether or not this is true or not. So why are we putting Jamaica and Kenya in the same conversation, the same basket? We share no geography, no ethnic ties, no foreign policy agreement. We are separated by an ocean and a continent. But here's the thing. As I live here in Kenya, I've come to understand that there are so many similarities. And I'm not going to dive into this in extent, but I just have to highlight them. And here goes. Number one, Both are former British colonies whose diaspora flows through the same three corridors, the US, the UK, and Canada. That means that both communities navigate the same immigration system, experience the same racial dynamics in host countries, face the same cost of living pressures, and are subject to the same policy changes. Number two, both countries punch dramatically above their weight in global cultural influence. I did a video on this and I'll reference it here so that you can take a look. I'm not going to dive in further. Number three, both diasporas are driven by cultural identity, not events. Guyana's return is oil. Ghana's return is a marketing campaign. Jamaica and Kenya's return is continuous, generational, and cultural identity based. It does not need a trigger. It's simply there. We are who we are. Number four, both are shifting towards a circular migration rather than permanent relocation. For example, the modern Jamaica diasporan citizen works remotely from Kingston or Montego Bay. He or she might maintain a property in Negril, but holds a US or UK visa or passport. The modern Kenyan diaspora citizen invests in Kenyan real estate from Houston, visits twice a year, and runs perhaps a company that they can manage via M-Pesa. Number five, both governments have built diaspora engagement infrastructure to a certain degree. It looks substantial on paper, but it falls short in practice. Jamaica has the biennial Diaspora Conference. Kenya has the Kenya Diaspora Alliance. Both have policy documents. Neither have solved the returnee problem in practicality. Number six, both face the third culture generation challenge. Jamaica's government has created the Global Jamaica Diaspora Youth Council, targeting second and third generation Jamaicans aged 18 to 35 to encourage them to return to Jamaica. Kenya's diaspora podcasting ecosystem, for example, Gracie the Kenyan Diaspora and Returnee podcast, Diaries of a Diasporan, they serve partially to maintain identity for younger Kenyans who have never lived in Kenya. How do you maintain cultural identity across a generation born entirely in the diaspora? Both countries are actively trying to figure that out. And number seven, both face the returnee paradox, celebrated in the abstract, resented in the specific. The welcome speech at the Diaspora Conference and the whispers in the community are both real. And both countries need to reckon with that contradiction, honestly, if they want the migration to become a genuine development tool rather than just a talking point. So yes, we share the same trap, but different doors. Despite the differences between the Jamaican and the Kenyan experiences, the underlying structure of what returnees face is remarkably similar. Reverse culture shock that makes returnees feel foreign in their own homeland. Bureaucratic systems that require personal connection rather than transparent processes. Here's one that you will understand. The expectation from family that returnees should be wealthy. Social tension between those who stay and those who left is unmanageable at times. Mental health support is unfortunate and non-existent, and it's also heavily stigmatized. And that affects those that are also returning home as well. This one is large. Family members entrusted to manage diaspora assets who may or may not manage them honestly. And lastly, and perhaps most painfully, the fundamental mismatch between idolized version of home that's sustained you through the hard years abroad, and then the actual daily reality of life in a developing countries that didn't pause for you while you were away. Those are some of the challenges that a returnee faces that sometimes and most oftentimes are not viewed by individuals and families that you return to. And nobody dare to break this down to you as I'm doing right now. So if this content is hidden, give me a thumbs up. This is not a video about why you should not go back. I want to be very clear about that. I am not here to discourage return. I wanted to go back, but instead I chose Kenya. And I believe that the movement of the diasporans going back to their homelands is right now. This is the time. So we need to have these discussions and we need to talk about them because it is important. I also believe that this is one of the most powerful forces available for genuine national development. Skills, network, capital, perspective. The diaspora carries it all. But I'm also not going to pretend that the challenges do not exist. So let's talk about what actually works and what needs to be fixed. The circular migration model is working. People who maintain connection, who visit regularly, who invest strategically, who build networks before they physically relocate, report significantly better reintegration outcomes than people who make a single clear break and then attempt a full return. The lesson from both Jamaica and Kenya is don't burn your bridges. Use it. Use it to build over time. Since we are both tourism countries, it makes sense to look at community-based tourism as investment. This is where you build something small scale, not challenging or trying to become a large ecosystem resort. No, we're talking about something small scale, something that you could advertise as an experience-based tour to individuals. That is how you're going to break in and compete with the larger chains. So yes, smaller local-led ventures, short stay visits, eco tours. What you want to do is focus on satisfying a larger number of tourists that want unique experiences. One more thing I want to say regarding the Kenyan side is that M-Pesa and the blockchain infrastructure has made money movement nearly instantaneous. This gives Kenyan returnees a huge advantage because now you're able to build and to set up while using this said infrastructure to fund and to capture funds almost immediately. Unfortunately, I cannot say the same for Jamaica, although some people have managed to do so, have managed to manage from abroad. And I am only going to say this. It is best to select your boots on the ground very carefully, as that is the key factor that will make or break your level of success. In Kenya, land fraud prevention requires digital land registry, point blank. A reform that has been promised and partially implemented, but it needs to be completed. A diaspora member managing land investment from Toronto should be able to verify title deed online in real time without having to rely on a local intermediary. The technology exists, and this is definitely a step-up priority. In Jamaica, we have a problem. The theft, the violations, and the crime. 300 returnees were unalived over a span of a decade. The number of lives that were affected and the families of those returnees, that has to stop. Without question, this is even embarrassing and demoralizing talking about this. However, it needs to be discussed and it needs to be addressed, not just by a policy change. There needs to be a collaborative effort put into reassuring returnees that their lives won't be at risk. And I'm not saying that we should be privileged. I'm saying that we should be granted the position of being allowed to return home in dignity and with protection so that we can contribute back to the island. That is my take on that, because there are so many Jamaicans that want to come home but are still afraid. And I know that the numbers have reduced, but the stigma that has left on the diaspora abroad, on individuals that are tired of the cold, on individuals that want to leave countries that do not treat them like citizens, that do not treat them like people. So I implore the Jamaican government to do their job. There are many other points that both countries, both governments need to address. But when it comes to returnees, let's start here. Let's start at those two distinct points. Let's start here. However, the data does not show two populations racing home. The returnee paradox is real in both places. Whether Jamaicans and Kenyans return permanently or not is almost beside the point. The intention itself shapes the economy, the politics, and the cultural identity of both nations. So what have we established? Jamaica and Kenya produces diaspora communities that are at the core doing the same thing. They're living in two different places at once, sending money home, visiting consistently, investing in land, telling their children where they come from, keeping the idea of return alive, sometimes for decades, before the return itself actually happens, if it happens. But here's what I also know to be true. The people who go back and make it work, who navigate the complexity with clear eyes, solid financial planning, and genuine community investment, they change things, not overnight, not without difficulty, but they change things. Skills transfer, networks get built, businesses open, children grow up watching someone from the diaspora prove that return is possible. That is worth something, and it's worth quite a lot. Now here's something. It would be remiss of me to not discuss a fourth option. After going through all that we've done, the fourth option is not included in the migration statistics. No government tracks it. It's not included in the International Organization of Migration. There's no column for this. And yet, it is or may be the most honest expression of what the diaspora experience actually produce in a person over time. The choice is to return, just not here or there. As a Jamaican, I chose Kenya. I am Jamaican in Kenya, and I'm living the circular migration model, connected to both in residence, but neither in the traditional sense. But I'm at peace with that complexity. It is not the version of return that was traditionally sold to me, but it's mine. It works and it's real. To go home to myself, to my values, to my place in life, my space, without having to go back to a specific geography that holds all of that complications. I made this choice. I did not return to Jamaica. I returned to me, and I did that in Kenya. And I want to say clearly to everyone sitting with that same quiet thought that it is not a betrayal. This is not me giving up on where I came from. This is me being honest about where I actually want to be. This is me choosing where I need to be. Because here is what I've found on the other side of that decision. The crime does not weigh on me. The Moju syndrome does not find you. The land fraud, the contractor who disappears, the electricity bill that defies all logic, those are not pounding at the door. What is waiting is space, actual, physical, psychological space. The space that you need to find your peace. The ability to build something from that place of clarity rather than obligation. To be a stranger in a way that I feel that I've chosen instead of it being imposed upon me. To be seen as competent before I'm seen as a cash machine. To be listened to and to be intrigued by my origin instead of being viewed as uppity. There are those of you watching right now who have been carrying this weight of return that no longer fits you, that no longer fits who you've become. And I want you to hear this. The version of home that you are longing for is real, but it doesn't have to be a postcode, a city, or the village that you came from. It can be a feeling in a community elsewhere. It can be in a country that sees you clearly and lets you get on with it while you stay connected to who and where you're from. I hope you understand what I'm saying. And please feel free to replay this and let it sit with you. You are allowed to redefine what coming home looks like for you. I did, and I've never been more at peace. If you're thinking about your own version of this, if you are somewhere in that space between I left and I might go back, I built something that might be helpful for you. It's called the Digital Relocation Blueprint. It's designed specifically for people who want to build an income foundation before moving back home. Not after, before. Because going back from a position of financial strength is a fundamentally different experience than going back and hoping it will work out. If going back, repatriation, or relocation is your goal, the Digital Relocation Blueprint is your first step. I've added the link in the description below because I found my peace and I wish that for you as well. But you can't get there without a plan. Drop a comment and tell me where you are in this journey. Are you still in the diaspora planning to return? Have you already gone back? Or are you living the returnee experience right now? Have you tried to return from overseas? Every version of this story is valid, and I genuinely want to hear yours. If this video added value to your day, please share it. There are people in your network who needs to hear this conversation. Hit subscribe if you haven't already, and don't forget to hit the notification bell to be notified of any new video uploads. And lastly, click on the thumbs up to let YouTube know that I've given you something to think about. Thank you. As they say here in Kenya, badai, lekomor.